Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. Two photos, same raw file, same software. One looks stunning, clean, natural, professional. The other, a total train wreck. And the wildest part, many people think this actually looks good. Why? Because Lightroom and other programs give you powerful tools, but never actually teaches you how to use them correctly. So today, I'm exposing 5 sliders that are destroying your photos and showing you exactly how to fix them fast. If you've ever wondered why your edits don't have that professional pop, stick around. This will forever change the way you edit your photos. So the very first one is something that I call the silent killers. And this is a good example right here of an image that has all 3 of these silent killers pushed pretty far to the max. And as you can see, it's texture, clarity, and dehaze. There is a lot of, I hear about this often, what the difference is between texture and clarity. And I'm gonna show you really quickly how big of a difference these 2 sliders actually are. So let me reset all of these back to 0. And let's zoom into an area, say this area right here. So as I toggle texture back and forth, you can really see what's happening right here. It's really good. It's showing off a lot of the fine details in a scene. And if you look up here at the histogram, pay attention to what's happening as I swing this to -100 and +100 back and forth. There is very little change happening to the histogram right there. And whenever you see that, that's a telltale sign that it is a very subtle enhancement. It's a very subtle tool. It's not creating these massive changes to your images. But texture is great for enhancing the small detail, for sharpening a photo in a more subtle way. Now clarity, on the other hand, watch this. Let's zoom back into area right here. Let's take clarity and let's swing this back and forth. So a massive difference right here. Now clarity adds a ton of mid-tone contrast, and it can make an image pop, but it can also make it look very harsh. Now once again, pay attention to the histogram up here as I swing this to -100 and +100. That's a much bigger difference. And you can really see those midtones in the center of the histogram really start to expand out. So as I toggle this back and forth, watch what happens. You can see how it's really pushing out to the left and to the right. And that is really telling you that it's adding a lot of mid-tone contrast to your overall scene. And you can visually see that, not only in just the histogram, but just looking at the photograph. Let's zoom all the way out here and let's take this all the way to +100. See that? You can see how much contrast it's adding to the photo. So it's adding a lot of contrast. It's also enhancing those large size detail in the overall photograph as well. Now dehaze, on the other hand, dehaze is definitely different than texture and clarity, but dehaze, I think we all know this, it cuts through fog and haze, but it adds a ton of contrast and it really can oversaturate your colors. So let me reset clarity real quick. Look what happens here and look at that histogram. So this right here tells you how powerful or how much this slider is doing to the overall photograph just based off of what is happening to that histogram. Huge changes are occurring right here. So it can cut through fog and haze, but it can really make your photograph look muddy. It can make it look overprocessed. So you really want to be careful with dehaze. So really the big fix here is using texture in a very subtle way to enhance small detail or to sharpen your photograph. You can use clarity to enhance the larger size areas of your photograph. That's good for adding some contrast to a scene. So I maybe want to add just a little bit of there. And I really only use dehaze when necessary. I often will just use dehaze for the sky or maybe for the foreground or whatever the case may be. But try and get very selective with dehaze, and I only use that when it's absolutely necessary. Now, the next one is something that I call the flat edit trap, and I used to do it for years, and this is a good example here, where you're looking at this photograph, and it just looks like it's lacking contrast, it's lacking all kinds of 3D, and the problem here is that the shadows and the black point is pushed way too far. I mean, they're both at +100 now. So, and that absolutely can kill the depth of a photograph, and it can destroy the contrast in a scene as well. So let me reset these both back to 0. So when the shadow slider here, this right here only affects the shadows. It's not touching the darkest areas or the true blacks of a photograph, just the shadow area. And the black slider here is only affecting the absolute true black of a photograph. It's not impacting the shadows. So that's a very important, it seems like a subtle nuance between those two, but that's a huge difference here. So the black slider here really only impacts the deepest tones in a photograph, and the shadows only impact the shadows. So a good way to do this here, so when I look at this photograph, I can see there's a lot of areas right through here that are very dark. This whole area here is too dark. It's almost so dark to where I can't even see any kind of detail there. So what I like to do is first I will come up to the shadows and I'll bring the shadows up a fair amount to a point to where I can start to see a lot of that detail. So I can see all the detail through here. I can definitely see detail in this bottom right-hand corner. And from here, now I'll start to bring that black slider back a little bit, often into the lower negative values to maybe somewhere about right here. But that's gonna bring that depth back to the overall photograph. It's gonna create a more natural and dynamic look. And it really just balances the shadows with the black point. So cranking the shadows all the way up, cranking the black point all the way up is a big trap to get into to make your photograph look very flat and very dull. And I think that this right here looks much better. Now this next one right here, this is probably the most common one that I hear about, and it has to do with the highlight slider. So what many folks will do here is you can see how the highlights down to -100. When you strip out all, or when you lower all of the highlights in a photograph, it creates a very flat looking photograph. It creates kind of a dull look. It really reduces a lot of contrast in the overall photograph, and it just looks a little bit off. So what many folks will do is, you can see this photograph here is slightly overexposed. You can see that in the histogram here. And people will want to just take the highlights and bring it all the way down to -100 because it brings that beautiful detail in the sky. And at the same time, it reduces the exposure, but it's a recipe for creating a very dull and low contrast image. The highlight slider is really meant to only recover the detail in the brightest areas of a photograph. So if you do have a bright image like this right here, you are always better off reducing the exposure with the exposure slider first to a point to maybe right here. And then you can get a little bit more selective with your highlights. You don't have to crush it down to -100, or you can come up here and create a mask. Let's just do a linear gradient and just drag it all the way down the scene here, and then get very selective and just reduce the highlights right there. But lowering your exposure first and then just making a more subtle adjustment with the highlight slider is a much better way to not ruin the overall contrast and preserve a lot of the highlights in a photograph, because highlights are very important to a scene. So taking it to -100 and trying to remove all of them from a photograph is really not a good best practice. It looks much better to let the exposure slider do a lot of the heavy lifting, and then use the highlight slider just to refine it that much further. Now this next one is, what's the difference really between the white slider and the exposure slider? I see these used interchangeably in many different ways I never even thought of, unique ways. It doesn't always create a good result. So this is a common example here. I did a lot of searching to find one that I felt was a good representation of this. But as you can see here, that the whites right through here, like all of this area up through here definitely looks overexposed. And that's because the white point is up too far. So let me just reset this here. This image here, you're just looking at the histogram, you can tell that it is slightly underexposed. Not too bad, but it is a little bit dark. And what I often see is people come over here to the white point and just start to bring that up to a point to where it starts to look a little bit brighter. So maybe about right here. And then they come up here to the exposure slider and start to bring it up further here. And if I hit the shortcut key J, the clipping indicator, you can see that now there are areas that are overexposed in the image. Let me turn that off real quick. So the white point here, this only impacts the absolute brightest areas of a photograph, the areas of pure white. So this is going to be the brightest areas of a scene. And then the exposure slider actually impacts every part of the overall image the same way. So when I bring these back and forth, so let me reset the white point and let's swing the exposure slider back and forth. You can see, look at the histogram. The whole histogram is moving. That is telling you that this exposure slider is increasing or decreasing the exposure of the entire scene. Let me reset that now. Now watch it when I bring the white point up. Only the right side of the histogram is really being impacted, and that's a big difference here. So the best way to do this if you have an underexposed photograph is to start with your exposure slider first, and we can bring it up to a point right here, and then you can hold down the Option key. And if you hold down Option on a Mac and take the white slider and just start to slide this over. And what you want to do here is you want to slide this over until you start to see any kind of tone starting to come through. So I can see right there that the white is starting to come through. And then I'm gonna back it off just a little bit here to about right, maybe right here, I think looks pretty good. And now if I hit the shortcut key J, there are no areas of the scene that are overexposed, but the overall exposure of the scene is much more balanced. And this looks much, much better now. Now this final one is probably the most common one. You probably already know what it is, but it's vibrance versus saturation. I see it constantly. This is a good representation of it right here, where people use both of these sliders heavy-handed at the same time. And I'll tell you what, there are very few instances where you would want to use the vibrance slider and the saturation slider at the same time. But cranking these up right here is just a recipe for disaster. It makes the image look very cartoonish, very out of this world, and actually just looks pretty bad. So let me reset both of these. So vibrance basically just impacts the more muted colors of the scene. It's great for preserving skin tones if you're photographing people or if you're a portrait photographer. But vibrance is a really good way to create a more natural look. So it's only gonna impact the more muted colors in a scene. And as I kind of bring this back and forth, you can see that. And if I take it down to -100, you can still see that there's red, there's still color in this scene. But now if I come over here to saturation and take this to -100, there is absolutely no color left in this scene. This is a completely black and white photograph. And that is because saturation increases or decreases all colors equally, and it can really make a photograph look very overdone very fast. So a better route to go here is if you are wanting to increase the colors in the image, like this one right here. The colors look a little bit dull right now, but the colors are one of my favorite aspects of this photograph here. There's a lot of beautiful color. So a better route to go is just to boost the vibrance up a little bit to about right there, and then come down here to color mixer and select saturation. And then you can start to bring back the colors or increase the saturation of the colors you want to. So I can bring up the reds, I can bring up the oranges in this scene to maybe right here. Yellows, we can swing this back and forth and see what that's doing. Maybe the blues a little bit. And as I toggle this on and off, this entire section, this is before and after. Before and after. And as you can tell, this is a much more subtle look. So using vibrance here and then coming down to the color mixer section gives you much more precise control. It creates a much more subtle, more realistic, a much more natural look. But using vibrance and saturation at the exact same time, especially heavy-handed, is a recipe for disaster. So I do hope that information was helpful. And before I do wrap things up here, I just want to say a huge thank you to the sponsor of this week's video, which is Squarespace, who I use for all of my website and e-commerce needs. Squarespace offers a stunning, user-friendly platform to build your website. With their Blueprint AI design system, you can showcase your photography and create a standout online presence with ease. Plus, built-in Squarespace SEO tools help your site appear in more searches, making it easier for the right customers to find you. And if you're looking to sell online, Squarespace's online store feature provides everything you need to sell your physical goods, digital content, or services seamlessly. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/Mark Denney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So if you have any questions in regards to any of these 5 sliders or these 5 tool sets, definitely leave those in the comment section below and I'll do my best to get back in touch with you as soon as humanly possible. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you carving out a little bit of time to spend it with me here today. And I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.